Hi everybody, this is a re-recording of the lecture from week 5. Unfortunately, the recording didn't work live during the lecture, so I'm just creating this video now to go through the content that I covered in the lecture, and I'll do my best to cover everything that I went through. I also answered some assignment questions last night in the class. I will cover these off, some of these off in this mini lecture. But if you do have anything else, I would urge you to please post it on the Google Plus community so that we can discuss it. So last night what we did is we looked at the tools that you need for selecting when you select items for your library. The first thing that I talked about in class was budgeting. There were some budgeting mini lectures to watch in the learning resources that hopefully most of you have watched by now and have had a look at. And I just talked about budgeting very briefly, and I just want to touch on that again. So clearly, budgeting is a very, very important part of selecting. You need to make sure that you're operating within a budget and that you don't go over that budget. Depending on the type of library that you work in, you're going to have a different budget. And that can be for a variety of reasons. It might be, if you're in a school, it might be how much the school decides to give to the library, depending on the management of the school. With a council, it might depend how much, if you're a public library, how much money the council actually has to devote towards a library, how big the council area is and how much money they've got for resources. With academic libraries, again, it will depend on the university's financial status, the way that they see the library, how much money they can afford to give. And sometimes with academic libraries, it's also, when you think about things like the Australian dollar can also affect it. A lot of the tools and resources you're buying are actually bought in US dollars. So sometimes things like the Australian dollar can have an effect on what you can buy and what you can't buy in an academic library. So budgeting is obviously very important when it comes to libraries. And I really wanted to cover this off because you will have noticed that in your reports that you're writing, your collection development report, there is no budgeting aspect. We don't ask you to put a budget in. When you look at the exemplars from previous years, you will see that we have asked for budgets. We decided to take the budget element out of the assessment brief this year, and I wanted to give you a little bit of an explanation behind that. It's not because budgets aren't important in the real world. As I've just said, budgets are crucial. But what we have found in the past is that getting information about budgets is really, really difficult for students. So what happens when you try and we give you something, we give you a budget to work towards, is oftentimes students spend a lot of time ringing around vendors and doing things like that to try and find prices. Now, getting a price for something like a database is practically impossible because what you find yourself doing is there's no advertised price. You have to speak to a vendor. You have to find out that price, and then the price will depend on whether you're part of a consortia or not. You guys are obviously students. It's extremely difficult to get that information or even like a rough estimation. Same things for things like ebooks. If you think I want to get 5 ebooks, can I buy them as part of a collection? It takes up a lot of your time trying to pin down prices, and that's time that we felt could be better spent doing things like user needs analysis and selecting really good resources. So that time that you would spend chasing around trying to get prices can be spent somewhere else. So remember that budgets are important. We haven't left them out of the assessment brief because we don't value them. It's more that it becomes a real struggle for you to actually find real prices, and we think that your time could be better spent elsewhere. So that's basically all I wanted to say about budgeting. Okay, so the next thing that I wanted to talk about is micro and macro selection. And what we were talking about last week in the lecture, when we had all the guest lectures, was basically micro and macro selection. So micro selection is line by line selection. So line by line selection is obviously the librarian is going through and they are selecting item by item individually exactly what they want. So micro selection is time consuming, but it is valuable as well. So you tend to do micro selection on either very small collections, highly specialized collections, or when you're looking to develop a new area of the collection. So an example that I've got is when I was once in an education team doing some work as a librarian in an education team in an academic library, a new area of curriculum was brought in that Students now in primary schools look at different holidays around the world, so Australia Day, Bastille Day, those types of things. And they needed some books to support teachers as they talked about holidays throughout the world. Now, we didn't need a lot of books for the library, maybe 50 to 60 books, and these books were obviously going to be really highly specialised books. We needed to make sure that the content in the books covered off holidays in other countries, things that weren't being covered in the standing order. So I did some micro selection for something like that because it was for a very specific resource. So micro selection tends to happen around very specific resources or very specific collections. Macro selection is what happens when you have a standing order. So when Phil from Peter Powell talked about the standing orders that they have for the public libraries, or academic libraries will very often have standing orders as well, to get a lot of their core material in. So they know, public libraries know they want all the Pulitzer Prize nomination, all the books that have been nominated for Pulitzer Prizes to come in. That's part of their standing order. They know that they want the top 10, New York Times, whatever it might be. So they have certain books that they know that they want. School libraries will often have smaller standing orders for things like the school library will always want every book, the majority of books that are on the Children's Book Award list and things like that. So they will have smaller standing orders, but they will have standing orders of some kind. For those sorts of books, if it's a book that's won a Children's Book Award or has been nominated, school libraries will obviously sometimes have a standing order that's saying, just give us those books because we know they're good quality and we know that we are going to want them. Academic libraries, similar thing, where they say, we know we want books. We've got a faculty of business. We know we want the latest business books around this. So I really wanted to talk about which one is best, and there's no correct answer here because most libraries operate with a mixture of them both, with macro selection and micro selection, because they work really well together. Unless you're in a very small library, it's difficult to have the manpower to do micro selection on all your resources. So often libraries will have a balance of macro and micro selection. What we do with that is, you get your macro selection, and then you top it up with the micro selection. Sometimes, and this seems a little bit counterintuitive, when you do micro selection, you get a broader range of resources. So sometimes when you've got a standing order and it's macro selection that's getting selected for you, they might say, oh, you want books on, landscape design, and they might send you 5 books that are all very similar. Whereas if you'd been doing micro selection and you'd been looking at all the resources individually, you might have chosen books that covered the topic in greater depth, that were all very different and had different perspectives. So there are benefits to doing it both ways, but it all comes down to the time you can spend, the resources that you have. So a mixture of both is usually the best way to go about it. And I really put the question there, which one is best, to kind of get you guys to think about it, because I know last week there was some discussion about, it's always good to have a discretionary budget to spend. We heard from Jane Alexander, who said, they don't have a discretionary budget in Brisbane City Council. It's all done centrally, and librarians have no discretionary budget. And I know some people sort of thought, wow, that wasn't the best way to operate. And there's lots of different reasons why the Brisbane City Council do that, as Jane went into, but it's really up to the individual organisation is what I'm saying. So it's an interesting thing for you guys to think about what you think and why you think things should be the way that they are. Okay, so moving right along. So the next thing that we did in class, and this took up the majority of the time, is a little selection task activity. What would you buy? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you the selection task activity. I'm going to talk through it briefly. I'm going to tell you where you can find it on Blackboard, and then you can pause and go ahead and do it. So I'll just, go away from here. So there's a selection task activity, and you can find this on Blackboard. If you go into, and it says week 7, but it's actually week 5, that's my error. If you go into the week 5 resources and under class where it says attend, you'll see that this file's attached. Okay, so there's a few different tasks for selection. So the first task is you need to buy a full text database for a university with a new business school, and you need to decide which of the databases you'd purchase and justify your decision. So would you buy a database from EBSCOhost or from ProQuest? We've given you a context here. We've asked you to consider the coverage, the functionality, anything else you might want to. And we've given you a few information sources that you might like to look at. So vendor sites, academic database assessment tools, online reviews, reviews in library databases, and benchmarking. Looking at what other libraries have. The second task that you can choose from is a public library task, where you have $750 to spend on books related to search engine optimization for a public library service. You need 4 copies of each. So of the books listed, which are you going to buy to expend your budget? And we've asked you to consider the appropriateness for the audience, the currency, and the cover appeal, which, does it look good? So you can have a look at those. The third task is about reviewing sources. So when you work in a library, you get a lot of information coming across your desk from publishers, from vendors who are all trying to get you to buy their products, obviously. And you need to have you'll be able to cast a critical eye over the information that they give you to determine whether you want to believe that this information, is this just a sales pitch, or is this a credible review of a resource that I may wish to purchase? So with task 3, what you can do is you can have a look at the following passages and see if you can sort of pick out which are blurbs and which are reviews, and which one would you use. Okay, and the fourth task is a school library task, and this one is all about picture book selection. So it's to look at the notable books selected for the Children's Book Council of Australia, and have a look at the titles in the different categories, what they sort of look like, and then choose, if you could only choose 3 books for your school library, which 3 would you choose and why? Okay, so if you'd like to pause the video here to go away and do that task, don't spend, you can spend as much time on it as you want, and then come back. So I'll assume that you've paused it now, and I'll start talking through the tasks. So when everybody came back in class last night, and people spent about half an hour just looking around and sort of looking at these tasks, and what we really found was, and this is something that happens in libraries quite often as well, is that you can almost be overcome with choice. And the purpose of this exercise was not because there's a right answer. Nobody really fully completed the task in class. Nobody got it down to a final answer. And the aim was not to get you to have a final answer and to say, this is what I'd choose and this is why. The aim of this exercise was to get you to think about selecting and to understand that sometimes selecting can be very difficult and can be very time consuming, because we often get paralyzed by choice, and we want to make sure we're getting the perfect resource, and is this going to be okay, and it sometimes becomes a bit overwhelming for some people when they are selecting, to make sure they get the right things down. So one thing that we talked about is the fact that at the end of the day, absolutely, you want to get the best resource for your users. It is critical that you have your user in your mind when you select, but if you don't get the perfect resource, it's okay. Nobody's going to die. So sometimes when people select, they can get very worried. Yes, it's great to have a user focus. Yes, it's fantastic, but there's no such thing as the perfect resource. So you need to also be aware that when you're doing this at work, in real life, you need to be quick about it, is what I'm saying. You'll have time frames and budgets to expend. So with the first task, when we talked about the full text database, we've got a couple of different things. So some people were saying they'd go for EBSCOhost because it has, they'd go for Business Source Elite because it has more coverage. It covers academic journal, and it covers more academic and more business-oriented stuff. And some people said they'd go for ABI Inform. There's no right answer. It just depends on what your users want. In academic libraries, some of the databases that students need access to are really surprising. I know when I was working in a business area, some of the databases that they had for the marketing and communication students and advertising students were things that I never would have thought that these students needed. They were things that were giving them information about how much companies sell and do everything like that. Now, if I'd been assessing that, I would have thought, well, that's not an academically rigorous database. I'm not going to buy it. But the users need it. So that just shows why it's so important to keep user needs in mind. The public library, again, there's no right or wrong answer here. It's just thinking about which one's the most appropriate. Which one do you think is going to fit? How's that going to work, and how's that going to fit into your library? The third one, where we talked about review sources, this was one that lots of people found really interesting. So we knew that the first one was, the first two were sort of more blurbs, we thought, from the back. The third resource actually comes from The Lancet, which is a renowned medical journal, which is really sort of really interesting that got a review in The Lancet. And also just sort of shows you, hey, that's an interesting place for that to be. And obviously they've given it a pretty good review, so it's quite good. And then number 4 and 5 are sort of more informal blog type reviews. So we were sort of looking at that and talking about that. A point of discussion that came from this is these are all great reviews and resources, but there's lots of other ways to look at what might be popular. This is more appropriate for people in school libraries and public libraries, but it's a good thing to know what movies are coming out, what's current with what your clients are doing. If you're working in a school library, what are all the kids playing? Are they all playing Minecraft? Are there books around Minecraft or around building or around something that you can link to that current trend when you're looking at selecting? Is something going crazy on social media that all the kids in your school are talking about or your own children are talking about? If you're in a public library, obviously those things apply to kids, but you also need to think about what's going on with your other user groups. So is there a really big surge in, so lots of people, there's the grey nomads, as they call them, where people, go caravanning around Australia. Do you think that's a big thing in your area? Is this a trend? Do you need more travel books? Is genealogy taking off again? Or is genealogy dying and nobody's interested in it anymore? Do you need more books around something else? So it's about finding out what's going on in that community, and there are lots of different ways to do that. Talking to users, just having a general look at what's going on and what might appeal to your users. So there's lots of ways to get information about what might be appropriate to select. Okay, and the last one that we looked at was the picture book selection. And this was also really interesting because everybody has a different opinion here on which books they would like to choose. Again, there's no right or wrong. It's all about which do you think is going to appeal to your users, which cover is going to be the best, what's going to have the most cover appeal for your users. So it was just really interesting. And as I said, there were no right or wrong answers. The purpose of this exercise was absolutely not to say, this is the right way, this is the wrong way, this is what you should select. It's more about getting you guys to think about how difficult selecting can sometimes be and the things you need to take into account. Okay, so now I'm just going to talk a little bit more about the selection criteria that you might have in your reports. So the selection criteria section of your report, and these are some things that you might want to put into it. This is not an exhaustive list. You might look at this list and think you need some of them. You might think you need all of them. You might think that it actually is no good for you. You only want 3 or 4 of these things, and then you need some other ones because your collection is somewhat specialized. So most people will need content or subject, the authority of the author, the quality, the currency, is it a current book, and the language. Things like citation impact are going to be more appropriate for academic libraries. Geographical or historical coverage is really important if you were developing a collection, say, for Indigenous studies, for a particular area, or a South Pacific collection. So all those types of things. Special features, reading or user level, that might be appropriate depending what library you're in. So you need to think about all these things. And as I said, this is not an exhaustive list. These are just some selection criteria to get you thinking about what you might like to put in your report. We had a few questions about selection criteria and about the difference between where you would put this in your report. So I will talk that through in a second. I'm just going to quickly go to the last slide here, which was about which items do you need. So and this is all in the assessment brief, but which items do you need in your collection? In those 25 to 40 items, you need 5 digital items, 5 physical, 2 items within items, 2 digital, non-digital audio-visual items, 4 internet items, and 2 graphical items. Why do you need this makeup of items? Okay, I'm going to give you the background on this as well. I realize this is a constraint that you have to choose items in these formats. And if you're developing a collection, you might think to yourself, hey, I don't actually want one of these type of items in my collection. Why do I have to have it? I haven't done it to make life difficult for you. The reason that I've done it is the 2 assignments in this unit. So the first one is the collection development report, and the second one is where you build a database. Those 2 assignments used to have no link between them. So what you would do is you would develop a collection, your first assignment, and then that would be done. And then for your second assignment where you built your database, you develop a new collection to put into that database with these items in it. I've changed that, and the reason that I've changed it is because I think that when you have to develop 2 completely separate collections, again, it takes a lot of your time, and then I don't get to spend as much time with you, and you don't get to spend as much time learning about the intricacies of cataloguing. So learning about RDA and LCSH and all those different things and the technical aspects of cataloguing. By moving the collection that you've already got into a database, you're not redoing work about creating a collection. You have more time to focus on the actual technical aspects of cataloguing, and I think that's a much, much more valuable way to spend your time. So because we're doing that, you do need to choose items in these formats because it's important when we move into cataloguing that you're able to catalogue different formats. If you just chose 40 books, you would only learn how to catalogue a book. So that's why that is. There was a question last night where somebody said, can we just put, we don't want these items, but we have to have them? I understand that there are constraints. If there are some items in there that you think, oh gosh, this is terrible, put some asterisks beside them. And then at the bottom of your report, put an asterisk and say, these items were chosen specifically because of their format. That is fine. I understand that there are constraints. I'm not going to take marks off because it doesn't fit your criteria perfectly, because I realize that I'm giving you constraints. But I hope you can all understand that these constraints are there for a reason, because I think it will be more beneficial for your learning in the future to learn more about cataloguing. So that's why you need those items. A few questions about this were, does a series of books count as one item? And the answer to this is yes, to a point. If you say to me you're buying the Harry Potter series, which is 7 books, I'll give you that as one item. A manga collection of 300 books is not one item, because you probably wouldn't buy 300 of those books in the first place anyway. You might buy 20 to start yourself off and see how they go. And if your patrons like them, then you'd buy more. So anything up to 10 books in a collection, I'm willing to give you as one item. After that, though, you need to, they can't be, it needs to be more than one item. Things like a book, a book and a DVD, they might be the same piece of work, but that's 2 items. The book's one item and the DVD is one item, so you can't tie those together. So that was the main question we had, was around what counts as an item. So I did point everybody again to the example report structure that is up on Blackboard. I just want to emphasize again that this is an example report structure for your collection development report. So you need to look at it in a conjunction with the assignment briefs and criteria sheet. And what you need to do is look at this, as I said, in conjunction with it. And this is just a guideline. It's not exhaustive. You don't have to do it this way. You can think about doing it another way. It's however you want to do. I also suggest that you go into Blackboard and that you look at the example reports that are in there. As I said, they were written to last year's criteria sheet, not to the current criteria. So please don't take the headings from those and just use them, because they will be incorrect. They will all have budgets in them. You don't need budgets. They will all have a separate literature review. You no longer need a separate literature review. Instead, you should be using literature throughout your report to justify your selections. So have a look at this. And then if you have any questions about anything in it, I really would urge you to contact me on the Google Plus community to ask me any questions that you have about this assignment. So that was what we covered last night in class. As I said, I apologise that I am now re-recording this, but that is the information that I was given to everybody. You are all, please do contact me if you want to. The something I want to say about next week is that next week we are going to start looking at Content DM. Content DM is the database that you are going to be building your final database in. Sorry, the database you're going to be building your database in. Content DM is the platform you are going to be building your database in for your final assignment. Next week in class, for the second half of class, we're going to start looking at that. I'm going to get everybody set up as users. We're going to start going through a few basic things and start having a bit of a play with that. So if you are able to bring a device to class, or if you're listening at home, it's good to, obviously you'll be on your device, but good to have a larger device with you if possible, so that you can look at that and you can start to play along with us if we go through that. So we are getting started on the information you need for assessment 2 next week. So please, if you've got any questions about the report or anything in it, about anything at all, I really would urge you to post in the Google Plus or to get in touch with me. Thank you.